Hey, David. You're on mute.
Damn. There we go.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How's it going?
All right. Keeping busy.
Yeah, that's good.
Yep. All right. People are gonna be. They're all coming on now, so I'm gonna admit everybody.
All right. Yeah, I decided to ditch the virtual background because it was just cutting off too much stuff. Like if I held up a bar or whatever, it was just going
Yeah.
transparent. So I was like, I decided to just kind of tidy up a little bit.
Nice.
Much to look at, but you know, whatever.
Yeah. I don't have a. I have a white wall behind me, so I could, but it's not that good. Yeah. I'm gonna get a banner though soon, which would be cool.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Yeah. All right. So I know we have a bunch of people coming on now. Hello. So as everybody joins, we're going to have all the participants keep themselves on mute, and then we'll utilize the chat feature so that we can communicate and see what we want, like what everybody's tasting and experiencing and all that, and ask their questions. So as more people come in, we have about 3 more minutes before we'll start. Get ready and make sure you have your chocolate ready and your water and your tasting guides. Thanks, David, for the reminder. I have them here, and then we'll get set in about 2-3 minutes. All right. Ooh, that's hard. All right, so a couple more people are coming in, and I'm just getting the chat set up. So throughout the entire time, feel free to just put your questions in the Zoom chat feature, and if there's anything else you need help with, just put it in there, and we'll refer to that throughout the entire time. Okay. All right, so I think we're going to just start. So as you all may know, my name is Glenn Petriello. I'm the founder and owner of Chocotastery. I host chocolate education and tasting experiences, and I've been working with David the past few months, actually since March, since we had the industry Stay Home with Chocolate festival online, and we did a series 1 bundle, and that went very well, and we did a second one, and now this is the third one in the series. And so David, would you like to just introduce yourself if nobody knows who you are by this point? Just share a little bit about you.
Yeah, so my name is David Mekas. I'm the co-founder of LetterPress Chocolate with my wife, Corey. We started the company back in 2014 out of our apartment and did that for about a year or so. And then our landlord came in and saw equipment everywhere and said, yeah, I don't think so. Get it all out of here. So we got kind of threatened with eviction. We ended up finding a shared kitchen down the street from us. We moved into there. And then as we kind of grew, the owner of the building was like, hey, do you want to just buy this place? And we're like, sure. So we bought it and turned it into our own space back in 2017. And then we opened up to the public in 2018. So we've been primarily doing tours of our factory, selling chocolate in person and online. We started doing ice cream about a year ago. That's been going really well. We sold out of our Ghana Caramel Crunch about an hour ago. And people have been calling like, hey, can we get more? I'm like, no. So as soon as we get off the call, I have to go and make more ice cream. So that's been kind of interesting, kind of pivoting from, doing tours, which drove a lot of people into the store, to now doing everything either virtually or curbside pickup, things like that. So for those of you who don't know, LetterPress Chocolate is a bean-to-bar chocolate company. So that basically means we're sourcing cocoa beans from around the world. We import them, we roast them, grind them up, and we make primarily 70% dark, although today we're going to be playing around with the percentage a little bit. But I'd say most of what we do is 70% dark chocolate bars.
Awesome. All right, and we had a couple more people join. With that, I want to just reiterate some ground rules for a bunch of people who just joined us. First off, all of the participants who are joining us today will be on mute. And so we ask that you utilize the chat feature in Zoom to provide any questions that you have along the way. We'll be engaging with everybody as we taste. So we would like for you to, comment what your, the different attributes and all that, and what you're tasting and experiencing as well. We will be recording this as well, and it'll be going up on YouTube the next day or so. Time providing, we're shooting for an hour, and then if we have time at the end, we'll let you, if you have any other questions you want to come on and actually speak. We could do that if we have some time at the end. And so the last thing is the tasting guides. So everybody has access to the Chocotastery chocolate tasting guides. And I just want to take a moment before we jump right in to just explain this briefly. So everybody may have these printed out or on your computers. So basically, a couple of years ago when I started Chocotastery, I just come back from making chocolate for Indie Chocolate after quitting my HR day job and all that for a short period of time. And so what I wanted to do is to further help educate others on tasting chocolate so that they have a better experience and get that personal experience with chocolate. And so there's 4 different steps which we'll go through. So basically we're going to look at the shade of the chocolate, what that means. We'll look at the snap, what that means and how loud it is and what that means. And then going through the aromas, how much, what do you smell? And then lastly, when we start to taste it, what flavors are we tasting? And also you have a tasting sheet. So you'll be able to mark down your notes, and if you have any questions, you could just jot them down or just put them in the chat. So that these all cover everything we'll talk about, and any type of emotional past experience that that reminds you of. You want to make a note of that. Go right ahead. So as far as the order goes for today's tasting, we're going to go with the first one would be 75% Oco Caribe from the Dominican Republic. We'll have Belize, my mountain, that's 70%. We'll go with Satocao. Is that how I'm pronouncing it? Satocao?
Yeah, Satocao.
Satocao in Sao Tomé, that's 70%. And then lastly, the Bachelor's Hall, Jamaica, at 70%. All right, so with that said, does anybody have any questions or anything? So we did get one, is there a logic to the order? So predominantly, we want to start with the highest percentage first. So that's why we're starting with the Dominican Republic. It's 75%. And as we try to go with the highest percentage first, so that if you do it in the reverse, your tongue may be, being like affected by the sugar crystals in the chocolate. So if it's like a lower percentage, there's more sugar, and so that'll affect the way that you taste going forward. So so we're starting with a higher, and then obviously the other three, there's no rhyme or reason. They're all really great bars. So so we just put them in that order. But yeah. So the first one is from Oko Caribe. So David, would you like to share a little bit around Oko in how you guys created this?
Yeah, so what ended up happening was back in 2014 when we first started the company, we were kind of interested in the idea of not just starting a chocolate company, but also investing directly with different farms around the world, starting with a project in Guatemala that a buddy of mine runs. And so we were actually down there, and we were in Guatemala, we're checking that farm out, and then went over to Belize, checked out my mountain, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we go over to talk about Belize. But then while we were in Guatemala, there used to be, well, I think it's still around, chocolatelife.com. It used to be really active, I think before the Facebook group kind of took off. And so back then it was just kind of a message board, and I was just poking around on there, and someone said, hey, my wife is from the DR. I'm going to be bombing around the island for a week or so. Does anyone want to join me? And so I emailed this guy, his name's Tom. And I said, yeah, sure, I'll go. I never met this guy before. I'd never been to the DR before. I was actually between projects. I was working at DreamWorks Animation at the time as a computer graphics artist. And what ended up happening was I had finished one movie and I was about to go on to another one. And the way it works is that you can kind of say, hey, I want to take, a few weeks off or a month off or whatever. So it's actually pretty easy to take some time off between projects. So I emailed DreamWorks. I said, hey, is it cool if I take a couple more weeks off? They're like, oh yeah, sure, it's totally fine. So I emailed Tom back. I said, yeah, sure, I'll meet you in the DR. So we flew back from Guatemala to the US. I was in the US for, I think, 14 hours, and then got on another plane, flew down to the DR. And there's this guy, he just shows up and he's like, hey, I'm Tom, are you David? I'm like, yeah. And he's like, cool, let's go. So we spent the next week and a half just bombing around the island, just checking out different cacao farms. And one of my favorite ones was this one. It was Oko Caribe. And it's right in the middle of the country in an area called San Francisco de Macorís. And there were two farms that really impressed me a lot in the DR. Oko, which we're about to try, and then La Red, which I'll talk a little bit in a minute. But as far as just like the actual facility, I mean, it is spotless. It's amazing. The people are incredible. It is one of the nicest cocoa processing centers I've ever been to. And we also checked out Conocado and Rizek and a bunch of other ones. But this one, what I really like about what Oko does is that they encourage farmers in that region to not just plant monoculture. So monoculture, for those of you who don't know, is when you just plant one thing. So imagine like fields of corn in the US or sugar cane, in Hawaii or wherever else. It's just row after mile of just one thing. That's actually really bad for the environment. It's bad for the soil. It's just bad for any animals in the area. So what Oko does is to actually incentivize all the farmers in their network to have sustainable agroforestry systems. That means the cacao is growing in conjunction with a lot of other things. It could be papaya or banana or whatever else. And the idea is that you have multiple things growing within one little ecosystem. And we felt that that was really interesting. And for me at the time, it was one of my favorite projects, like I said, that we had visited. And we brought some beans back, made some test batches, fell in love with it, and then decided to start bringing it in. So that was back in 2014. So this is probably one of the longest projects that we've been working with since we started. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And just so you know, to make a point, that Tom you're referring to is Tom Forbes, who's on with us, if you hadn't noticed.
Oh, hey Tom, how's it going? Did I tell the story right?
So it's really funny. It's cool. So getting into tasting it, so everybody could look, you know, see if you want to start writing in in the comments, like what is like the kind of the shade of brown that you expect. It's the first one, so we can't compare it to other chocolates, but we can kind of just get a gauge on just how dark it is compared to like the scale of, you know, light, medium, or really, really dark. So it's kind of there. So I'm thinking it's a little bit like a medium to dark. So the next step is you know, breaking it. So when we break it, we're going to be you know, seeing how well tempered the chocolate is. So part of the chocolate process, we like chocolate makers, they roast once they get the fermented and dried cacao, they roast and then they take apart the cacao bean shell from the nib inside and refine the nibs down. And so when they refine the nibs down, they add in their sugar or additional cocoa butter, and then they have to temper the chocolate so that you get the nice shine and snap that we like. And so basically there's a specific temperature range where we stabilize the sugar. And so when you snap, it's significant of how well tempered that was. And also what could affect and will most likely affect for me is that my room here that I am in is hot. So it may not have a good snap. So David, you may want to snap on your end. Yeah, so for me, it's a decent snap. And so, so now, how are, when you guys are, you know, snapping your chocolate, do you get a good snap? You can, you know, just put in the comments, and then we'll see your answers.
There's my microphone, there we go. A little bit. It also, yeah, the color, because it is a 75%, it is going to be a little bit darker than some of the other ones. So just kind of holding it up there, it's a little bit tricky, but yeah, definitely on the darker side, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. So is there any aromas that you guys are smelling when you're bringing it to your nose? And yes, snapping anywhere, you could snap it anywhere. And then once you're ready, you know, I'm smelling a deep chocolate note. Is anybody smelling anything different? So we have one is berry. Cool. And so now we want to just you know, put it in our mouth. We'll just take a bite or two and then just let it melt, move it around, and then aerate it so that the aromas of whatever the flavors are will go up through your nasal passage into your brain, and you'll recognize what those flavors are. So we're getting some flavor notes in. We're getting a citrus aroma and spice, nutmeg and clove. All right, and then a deep cherry smell aroma, and it's a deep dark fruity. Awesome.
We should probably also mention that, we have tasting notes on the bars, but there is no hard and fast rule saying that this is what you should be tasting. Everyone's palate's different. There's all sorts of different things. It depends on what you ate prior to, trying the chocolate. So I would just say that these are guidelines. This is just what we tasted when we were first making the chocolate. So I don't think that there's such a thing as a right or a wrong answer. So I think it's totally valid to just throw out anything that you're tasting is completely cool, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Yep, that's correct. So what else are we seeing? We're seeing a lot of very fruity notes and cherry. And I agree. I get like a burst of like red fruit, that cherry note. And it's like a little creamy too, to it. And with this, I believe this is a 2-ingredient chocolate. So just strictly, the cacao refined down to chocolate liquor, and then sugar, cane sugar. Yeah. So any other comments, experiences that you want to share? So somebody says a slight, almost burned flavor.
Yeah, I think this is one of the heavier roasts that we've done from our different origins. So Dominican cacao definitely holds up to a heavier roast than, say, some of the other origins that we worked with in the past. So this one also, I think, with the DR beans in general, you tend to have a little bit more of that kind of red berry note. I think it was a little bit more pronounced in our other Dominican bar, which was La Red. Which was like, it tasted like it actually had cherries ground into it. And it was just a very, very fruity bean that we worked with. And so one thing I didn't put on the tasting notes that I get when I taste it is that there's a little bit of a tannic structure, almost like a black tea. If you imagine like a really dark brewed black tea, I get a little bit of a tannic note in there personally. But again, everyone's palate's different. There's no right or wrong answer for that.
Yeah. So we also got a couple that another says cherry, and somebody else is getting that same tannic experience, which is really cool. So we have a question that I think we're going to save a little bit later on. It's about the consideration for using sugar and versus alternative sugars. So maybe towards the end we can hit on that question. It's a little bit more general. So before we go into the next bar, which is the Belize, so we just wanted to talk about cleansing your palate between bars. We had a question around it before. So we normally drink regular water. It doesn't really do much to the fat per se, but it's better than drinking like coffee or like another, like an alcoholic beverage or something if you're just doing a non-alcoholic beverage tasting. So what we also have as an option is table crackers. This is the brand that I use. They're just water crackers. Basically, they have no flavor to them, but they help with absorbing all the fat from the cocoa butter and the bean in the chocolate that we're tasting. So if you have any, that's fine. If not, no worries. But we'll have a little taste, and then sip of water. And then we're off to the next origin. So this next one is My Mountain, Belize. So David had started to talk about My Mountain back in 2014 during his visit to the farm there. Do you want to give a little bit more insight into them?
Yeah, so basically what happened was, again, we were down in Guatemala. When we were heading out from Guatemala City into the Verapaz region, which is kind of like the highlands region of the country, we picked up this young woman, Emily Stone. Never met her before, didn't know who she was. And she happened to be friends with my buddy who was running the farm, Isabel Agroforest, on the east coast of Guatemala. So we picked her up and we're driving, basically the entire day from Guatemala City to Alta Verapaz. And she was basically saying how what she does, her company, I don't think it was called Uncommon at that point. I don't think they had come up with that name yet. I know it was just My Mountain, and then I think it was Cacao Verapaz, if I remember quickly. And so what happened was she was going to start a network of farmers all over Guatemala and start, doing a centralized fermentation and drying center. So her involvement had been through My Mountain Cacao in Belize. So what had happened was once we were done in Guatemala, she's like, oh, you should totally go check it out. So we went over to Belize and we checked out the farm. And I think at the time they were working with like maybe 80 or 90 farmers in the area. And we got some samples of beans, brought it back to the States, and really fell in love with it. And several months later, My Mountain had done a Kickstarter campaign, basically saying, hey, we need to kind of grow. We need to build a new fermentation and drying center. We really need, anyone who can help, would be really great. So again, I'm working at DreamWorks Animation at the time, which meant that I was actually earning money, which was nice at the time. And so as a result of that, it's like, cool, we could, afford to donate a little bit of money. So in exchange for donating money to My Mountain, that helped plant about 4,000 trees on their new demonstration farm. In addition to that, we also got a pretty decent shipment of cocoa beans from Belize. So again, this is another project we've been working with for about 6 years now, and it's been very consistent. It's just really high quality. It's one of the best origins that we worked with. A lot of bean to bar chocolate makers work with My Mountain. Funny enough, a lot of people like to kind of poo-poo the Mast Brothers chocolate, but they were actually the first ones to kind of popularize it in the craft chocolate market. And I believe Taza also did, but then I remember Dandelion kind of came up, and then they started buying containers, and then Dick Taylor, and then us, and then a bunch of other people. So now it's a very kind of widely available bean. I think a lot of chocolate makers are working with it. I think, Glenn, you could probably speak a little bit better as far as like how many makers that you've seen making a My Mountain bar. It's quite a few now, right?
Yeah, there's like dozens and dozens. It's one of the origins that, like, when a lot of folks start making chocolate, they are working with Emily and her team at Uncommon, and they go for going with a Belize. I think a couple of years ago it was a lot more more popular. They may have died down a bit, but still, like, a lot of the established chocolate makers are using beans from their area, which is great. So yeah, so let's start. Let's break this open. As you know, as you probably seen, because everybody just received these bars recently, the molds are absolutely phenomenal with the amount of detail that goes into it, and so that's something that, like, I admire in bars is the molds and the skill of designing them, and then obviously, like, that there's no like air bubbles in there or anything like that. It's very smooth with regards to like every intricate detail. Every line is like perfect. So that's really cool. So
Kind of funny too, because when we switched to this mold, Maselli, the company that made this mold for us, said, you know, because we'd sent them the artwork, and they said, "There's no way you can do this. It's not possible. You're going to get chocolate stuck in all these little grooves." And I said, "No, we grind our chocolate pretty fine. I mean, we typically aim for about 14 to 18 microns." And so we said, "Look, let's just try it." And they really didn't want to do it. They kept bumping on it and pushing back and saying no. And so they actually sent us an alternative version of the artwork that we had sent them, where it basically looked like a cartoon. It looked like a 5-year-old drew our logo onto a piece of chocolate. And let's just say I had a not very pleasant phone call with them after that. And they basically said, "Do it this way with this amount of detail. Let's just do it and let's just see what happens." So we did some prototypes and it worked totally fine. So now the irony is that Maselli's like, "Hey, is it cool if we photograph your mold and put it on our website?" And it's like, okay. So, you know, now they're using it as an advertising thing, but whatever. But funny enough, one of the things that chocolate makers have to do sometimes is polish the molds between each batch. If chocolate does get stuck in there, like let's say you had a problem with temper, where you have, you know, the crystallization didn't quite work out and it kind of melts a little bit too fast, it can actually get stuck in the mold. And so in that case, you definitely have to wash. But typically speaking, you just polish, you know, in between batches. And what we found is that with these molds, because they're generally flat microfiber cloth, you just wipe it down and it's actually faster than what we were using before with that kind of 24 square mold. Because you had to kind of take, you know, the microfiber cloth and use your fingers and kind of like, you know, rub up and down 6 times in a row. Glenn, I don't know if when you were working at Indy, did you guys polish molds or how did that work?
yeah, we use a microfiber cloth too. Yep. Yep. Even my old molds, for those who may not know, I had my own chocolate brand many years ago before working at Indie Chocolate. And I had a basic mold, but I wiped them down with the microfiber and they worked. So let's start by looking at the shade of brown on this versus the Oko, and you can kind of see already that it's much lighter. I don't have the best light here, but where you guys are, it looks like some of you have some really great light, and you could, you know, just make some comments in the chat as to like just how different it is. So next would be to snap it. So it's a decent snap for a hot room like this. And so what aromas are you guys picking up on? Ooh. So I haven't like tried this bar in probably at least a couple of years.
Oh,
so
really?
I get, yeah.
Huh.
I've been going after all these the other origins. So I'm getting like a real nutty aroma, like a roasted nut note. All right, so I guess next thing would be to just go for it. What are you guys tasting in the tasting now? Someone says love. Interesting.
Well, that's in all the bars.
So, all right, so we're getting some in. Creamy, some fruit towards the end. We're getting cherry, raspberry, nuts, honey, fruity, nutty, like a lot of them say like creamy. So you get that creaminess in there too. And so just to make a note, this is only a 2-ingredient chocolate as well. So there's no added cocoa butter. And just to allude to that real quick, the reason, so there's different levels of fat in cocoa beans. And so sometimes beans don't have as much fat, so it's harder to work with when tempering the chocolate. And so a chocolate maker tends to add in cocoa butter so that it helps with the viscosity, and also gives a certain mouthfeel, a more luxurious, fattier mouthfeel, which could be very pleasant when you're tasting the chocolate. So we're getting a lot of fruit, cream, and nuts, much creamier and nuttier than the DR, and a lot of raspberry going on. So so yeah, that's just like tastes like chocolate. All right, well, there you go.
Yay.
All right. Job well done. Cool. All right, so put that aside. So let's talk about the next one, the Sao Tomé. So this is an interesting one because it comes from West Africa, and it's very unique. I remember David put this out, what was it, last year or so?
I think
last year or so?
I think it was about 2 years ago when we released it. I think it might have been late 2017, early 2018. I think we brought it in 2017 and we released it in 2018, yeah.
Awesome. So what's the story behind it? Because you are probably the only one that I've seen that actually has a bar from Sao Tomé. So what
in the United
was your
States,
perspective on that?
yeah, it's a very difficult origin to source. So basically what ended up happening was there's a French chocolate maker called Francois Préloux, and some of their chocolate is very good, some of it's okay, and some of it's not good at all. And it was interesting because I tried a sampler of their stuff. I want to say back in like 2015, maybe 2016, and one of them was Sao Tomé. And I don't think it was this particular project. It might have been a different one because there's this guy, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head. It's the guy who he like lives in Sao Tomé, and he has the kids like remove the radical from every bean by hand or something. This is not that project. It's a totally different thing. The name escapes me, but Préloux had put out this bar, and to me it was interesting, but I found that the cacao was more interesting than the chocolate, if that makes any sense. So chocolate makers, sometimes when they taste other makers' bars, they can kind of pick up on what the raw material was like and can kind of see past the processing a little bit. And I wasn't really happy with what Préloux had done with it, and I felt that there was something there that I wanted to explore. When we bring in cacao, we do it a few different ways. The most common way is to work with, say, like Uncommon Cacao, or we do with some of those collaborative shipping. So it's us in addition to several other chocolate makers. We all put in money for like a 40-foot container. We bring that in. We take a metric ton or two from that. Someone else takes a few tons, and then it just kind of gets divvied up. Now, the most difficult way of bringing in cacao is by air freight. So air freighting is extremely expensive, but it's really the only way to get really rare and unique cacao. So I got in touch with the guys over at Satocao, and I said, hey, is it possible to get a sample? And they said, oh yeah, sure. So we got to sample the beans, and I fell in love with them immediately. And I said, so what do we need to do in order to get the beans here? And so it basically had to go through this really weird circuitous route where it went from Sao Tomé to the African mainland, up to Amsterdam, and then to New York. And then from New York, we had to truck it over here. So the one kind of problem with that from, an environmental standpoint, obviously, is that that's a significant carbon footprint. So if we can figure out a way to kind of shorten that travel, that would be more ideal. So obviously you want to get as much as you possibly can, so you're not doing this over and over and over again. So we got a pretty large amount. So like Glenn, what you were saying, I think this is the only Sao Tomé chocolate made in the United States, even now, 3 years later. And part of that is the logistical issues with that. But like we were talking about earlier with Maya Mountain, for example, you kind of run into a situation where every chocolate maker is making the same 7 or 8 bars, and it gets kind of boring. So for us, what we really wanted to focus on was just trying to find really unique cacao that, you know, isn't necessarily easily accessible, and also just it kind of gives us a unique challenge, and it gives people something different. So it is a very unique cacao. I'm curious what people are going to say about the tasting notes, because this is one of the instances where we came up with tasting notes and then, you know, we kept making it, and we actually kind of changed things over time, and it actually kind of veered off from what we had printed. So I'm not going to say like kind of what we get until kind of we're done with that, but I just kind of wanted to throw that out there with that one.
Yeah. So one person said that the Sao Tomé bar was how they were introduced to you guys, and basically their sister-in-law bought them a bar from Wally's in West LA. I'm sure you know where that is. And then they've been hooked ever since. So that's pretty cool. Thank you for sharing that. And so we do have another question around environmental control for large logistics. So I think we'll save that one to the end of the tasting, because I think it's a little bit more technical. So we'll get through the tasting, and then we'll definitely answer that, Michael. All right, so let's talk about the color of the Sao Tome bar. And so this is a 2-ingredient chocolate as well. And compared to these other bars, I think we have one that's a little bit darker. I think, looking in the light. I think so. Yeah, so in between, like somebody saying yes, about the snap, not that much on my end. And of course, David, you're on mute. All right, so let's try it. What aromas we're smelling? Is anybody getting any different aromas from it? I'm getting just like a chocolatey aroma. But all right, so let's try it.
And I should also point out, we don't really talk about genetics too much, but I did kind of throw it out there. So like all other West African cacao, this is basically like a Trinitario. It originated from the island of Trinidad, where about 120 years ago, you had a Melanado and Criollo, and they were crossbred. And so what ended up happening was Criollo has really fine flavor, but it's very susceptible to disease, and they're having a heck of a time just trying to keep the trees alive. And so this other stuff in Melanado or even Forastero is just very hardy. It's just a fighter. It'll survive, you know, in climates and be disease resistant naturally. That Criollo is not. Criollo is a lot more delicate. So in Trinidad, they crossbred it. In fact, if I remember correctly, it was John Hart, a British biologist who had started crossbreeding this cacao, like I said, about 120 years ago. And he came up with Trinitario. So you have the flavor characteristics of Criollo, but then you also have the hardiness of a Forastero or a Melanado. And so that's what ended up getting transported over to West Africa, because cacao is not indigenous to Africa. It was introduced there. So pretty much all African cacao started from Trinidad. Now, later plantings came from, you know, Brazil and Ecuador and a bunch of other places, but generally speaking, at least in Sao Tome, this is a Trinitario cacao.
Awesome. And So somebody's getting woody note, and others are getting a tart flavor. So for myself, I'm getting like, there's like a little nutty going on, and then there is that like tarty, like fruity note. It's like a hint of it um, towards like the middle. Um, and you're getting woody aroma and chicory taste. Um, yeah, so some are getting nutty, and then it's becoming acidic. Um, awesome. Uh, chicory, chicory. It's kind of like sometimes you may know that there's a flavor note that's there that you can't think of. So that's just reminiscent of that. You may not have had experience tasting that flavor note or that food or whatever that flavor is that you're thinking of, that you that's there. So don't get discouraged by that. It's literally we recognize what we've had in our past history that helps us to put two and two together. So when there is a note like chicory, I know I haven't had chicory, but it kind of clicks like, okay, yeah, maybe that actually is that other note that I may not know. So I just wanted to point that out. Uh, awesome. Great. So, so the interesting thing is, like you said, David, there's the tasting notes on the package say peanut butter cup. So it's quite interesting. And to your point, yeah, it has veered away from that as like harvest to harvest and year to year.
Yeah, we say on our end that it's kind of more like a PB and J, where you've got, you know, that nuttiness that we were talking about, but it's also got this jamminess to it, right? And there's also almost like a yeasty note. So again, we say kind of like a PB and J because it's got kind of that bready kind of note as well as the nutty and the fruity notes. That being said, we did I don't know, it's not really a secret, but we got a new harvest of Sao Tomé recently, and we did make one batch. We haven't released it yet. And I'll just say that it's pretty different and in a good way. So when we do release that, we're excited about it. So that's probably at least a month or two away, because we are going to actually be redoing the packaging for that one. So what we have right now, this packaging is for what we all tasted today from that specific harvest, but what we have coming up will be different. So we'll, you know, obviously announce that on social media. It's going to be a while, like, so I have to go back and I have to redesign the packaging and get it printed and all that fun stuff. But we have made the chocolate, and we're pretty excited about it, actually.
Cool to know. This is where you get all your 411 on all new projects that David and Corey are working on. All right, so so the fourth bar that we're going to be tasting is the from Jamaica, from Bachelor Hall. So there's a distinct story about this that I'll have David share behind the story behind getting these beans, and yeah.
Yeah, so with Bachelor Hall, again, it's one of those beans that wasn't really kind of available to a lot of different chocolate makers, and it, I think it is now. I think more chocolate makers are starting to get access to it.
Yeah.
So kind of rewinding a little bit. So back in, I think it was around 2003, I tasted a chocolate bar, and I might still have a little sample of it somewhere. There's batch number 5 of Rogue Chocolate Pierce Bachelor Hall. And at the time, I thought it was the greatest chocolate bar I'd ever had in my life. And I had lunch with Colin, the guy who made the bar, I want to say in 2005. And I told him, I said, this is the best chocolate you've ever made. And there was just something about it that like just really drew me in. And I think I remember I got in touch with Desmond. He's like, I'm really sorry, you know, we're only selling tiny little lots of beans, you know, to either Pump Street Bakery in Southeast England or to Soma in Toronto. So those are really the only 2 chocolate makers besides Rogue that ever really got any cacao. So fast forwarding a few years, I had found out that Soma up in Toronto, they were moving from a smaller facility to a bigger factory. And so they weren't buying any beans at all for several months. And so I called Desmond up and I said, you know, since you're not selling to those guys, is it at all possible that I could get some? And he's like, yeah, how much do you want? I said, I'll take, you know, whatever you can get. And I think you could spare like 1 ton. So in case people don't understand, a metric ton of beans, when you make a 70% dark chocolate bar, you get the beans, and a metric ton is, you know, 2,200 pounds. By the time you get the beans, you roast them, you crack and winnow them, you remove the shell, you're left with the nibs, and then you add sugar and all that. It's roughly 1 to 1. Okay, so typically speaking, 2,200 pounds of beans will make 2,200 pounds of 70% dark chocolate. That obviously changes if, you know, you're adding more cocoa butter or you're adding, you know, more or less sugar, but typically speaking, it is 1 to 1. So we got a metric ton of that, and that is what this is. So we decided to go in a little bit different direction. Someone had mentioned the packaging design. Funny enough, I'm sure all of you have seen that Pixar movie, Ratatouille. So in Ratatouille, they did something very interesting, which was, again, my background's in graphic design and visual effects for movies. And many of my friends had worked on the film, and I actually got a chance to watch Ratatouille before it was released in theaters. And there's this really beautiful moment where Remy, the main character, he's trying to get his brother to understand how flavor combinations work. And he has his brother taste, you know, a little bit of like dairy and then some cheese. And visually on the screen, it's a black screen, and you see these shapes and colors just kind of moving around. And they did such an excellent job with that. And I thought, I want to try to figure out a way to visually convey the flavor of the bar in the graphic design of the bar itself. So that was kind of the idea behind it. So it's a visual representation of what I'm hoping that you'll taste. So hopefully that's not too much information. Sorry.
So we had a comment on the outstanding design and graphics on the packaging. Also have a question around how many bars is like 22 tons of cocoa beans equate to?
Well, I've never brought in 22 tons, but 2,200 pounds, you know, is, let's see here, that's 10,000. So 1 bag, sorry, I'm just doing the math really quickly. So 70 divided by, so 1 bag of beans will be about 1,200 bars, and you multiply that by 16, so about 19,000 bars for a metric ton.
Well, there you go. Also, we have a question on cocoa butter. So this bar, out of this 4-bar lineup, is the only one that has added cocoa butter to it. So where we have the question of why did you make the decision to add cocoa butter to this one? And are there any other bars in your lineup, overall lineup, that have cocoa butter, and like the reasoning behind that?
So I think let's taste the bar first, and then we can talk about the decision to add cocoa butter. I'll talk about that in a second, but I kind of want people to taste the chocolate first.
Okay, cool. So so I have the older version of the mold for this bar. So you'll get the old school look and feel of what letterpress bars were if it was before your time, before the time of the mold change. So as far as looking at the bar and comparing it, so it looks like it's a little bit lighter in color than the Sao Tomé. And so looking at the lightness, I think it's a little bit darker than the Belize. All right, so let me know what you guys are thinking, if it's similar as well. All right, so the snap, it's a pretty good snap, given that it's hot here. Yeah, so let's see, what aromas are you tasting? I mean, smelling.
And just so everyone knows, batch number 4, let's see, batch number 4. I think batch number 5 is the latest one. I don't know if we've released that one yet. I think batch 4 is the latest one that we've actually released. So that's the latest one that we have that's out in the world right now.
Yeah, so I'm getting like a chocolatey aroma. So let's go through. So what are you guys tasting as you go through that, the tasting of it?
Our Postmates tablet is blowing up. Hang on.
So we're getting some notes in of mocha and then durian without the smell. Interesting. And so somebody says, we have batch 4. We like the bar. It feels a little less complex, both smell and taste. Is that a function of the cocoa butter?
So as far as the cocoa butter goes, we add cocoa butter to I think 3 or 4 different origins right now. And when we add it, we're adding between 1 and 2%. So to give you an idea, like Caribe uses I think somewhere around 18%. Who else uses a ton? Oh, Bonade out of France uses 25%. Huge amounts of cocoa butter. So when we add it, it's very, very little. It's mainly for mouthfeel more than anything else. So this bar specifically is kind of like, it's not like those of you who tried our Ukiale bar, it's like this very complex, very, not challenging, but definitely there's just a lot going on. And so for me, what I really love about the Jamaica is that it's just a very accessible, just very, very nice chocolatey bean. And so whenever people say, well, I don't like dark chocolate, we usually have them try the Jamaica. We say, try this and tell us what you think. And people are always, blown away with that. And I think it's because it's just a really excellent idea of what chocolate can be. It's kind of what you expect chocolate to taste like, but there is some stuff going on. It is more subtle as far as like all the different flavor notes. And remember too, that when we're tasting some of these bolder bars, like, I would describe the other 3 bars that we've tried today much stronger in flavor. And while that can be great, I personally like a little bit more subtlety. And so this is a bar that, this is one of my personal favorites, and it's because it is so accessible. So this is one of my favorite origins that we're currently working with, besides Ukiale for different reasons. But yeah, it's just, it's kind of what I hope chocolate could taste like. And it's kind of a shame in a way that you have to go through all this effort to try to achieve something so simple. You know what I mean? Like it's actually an incredible amount of work to get that balance. And again, when you taste these other bars and then you taste this, what I would say with the Jamaica, as well as even Ukiale, or even those of you who are lucky enough to try our Hawaii bar, what I personally like to do when I'm tasting a new origin or new batch is we taste it first thing in the morning when our palate is fresh, before breakfast, before anything else. And I find that I can pick up on a lot of subtleties and nuances that I wouldn't necessarily be able to get if I had tasted several other bars, say later in the day. So this is a bar that I would very highly recommend going back and revisiting at different times of the day and just comparing those tasting notes, because we've actually gotten that feedback from people before where it's like, well, it doesn't really taste like much. And then they say, well, go back, try it again first thing in the morning with a fresh palate. And then, we'll get an email back later like, oh my God, I had no idea what was going on. There's all this stuff going on. And it's like, it is more subtle. And that's kind of the challenge when you do a tasting, because when we were doing tours in our factory, you know, it'd be a 45-minute long tour. You're tasting, you know, the fruit from the actual cacao pod, you're tasting nibs and liquor. And we went through 8 different dark chocolate bars, and people's palates, you know, just tend to get overwhelmed. Some people were like fine with it. They wanted to even, you know, keep trying more, but we found that it was kind of challenging for most people to do much more than 8. I think originally we did like 10 or 12, and most people were just like, that's way too much. And so they kind of, we took it down to 8, and that seemed to be better. But honestly, if you really want to pick up on all the nuances of all of our different origins, you really can't do more than 3 or 4 at a time, at least in my opinion. That's what I've always found challenging about chocolate shows. So imagine us having a booth with 12 different bars, right? And what, you're going to sample all those and then go to the table next to us after that and try 12 more? I mean, how does that work? You know, and I can't understand. For me, I can't do it. So I've always wondered at like chocolate shows how people were able to go through, you know, 100 or 200 different samples in a day. I mean, that's impressive, but it's not something that I would personally recommend, because you just get end up with palate fatigue. So just to kind of throw that out there.
Yep. So, so to finish up with the Jamaica bar, we did get a lot of notes of mocha, which is, you know, kind of the main flavor note outside of that chocolatey base note that you mentioned. That's pretty cool. And so we have a couple of questions coming in, and we have a bunch from before. So I want to just hit on those. So I think, let's see. So we could talk about the sugar as a topic. So the first question that was posed was about, I'm trying to find it. I think it's around adding like your decision to not have sugar, or if you'd ever use an alternative sugar in any of your bars.
Yeah, so when we first started the company, that was one of the first things that we kind of experimented with was, you know, what kind of sweetener are we going to use? And we played around with, I think, 30 or 40 different types of sweeteners. We played with, you know, kind of the more natural stuff like refined and unrefined cane sugar. We played around with panela. We played around with turbinado. We played with all these different sugars, coconut sugar and maple sugar powder. And what we found is that a lot of these sugars and sweeteners were interesting, but unfortunately they were affecting the flavor of the bars. And for me, it's like, that has a place, and there's several chocolate makers out there, for example, who use maple sugar powder. We've actually done some very limited runs for private client projects that we've done. And, you know, it's like, I don't want that flavor to kind of overwhelm, because again, with some of these beans, you don't want to obfuscate that. So for example, like, I think the most testing that we did was with coconut sugar. And we tried it with like, I think 4 or 5 different origins, and that's all we could taste was the coconut. And it's not bad, but it's like, it kind of made all the bars kind of taste the same in a certain way. And I didn't like that. So we finally settled on the sugar that we're using now. It's called Native. It comes from Brazil. It's an unrefined cane sugar. So one of the things that we had to take into consideration is that refined sugar is not necessarily vegan. It can be, but there's some question about that. I know that some manufacturers are using cow bone char as a part of the bleaching process. And so by using unrefined cane sugar, there's no concern with that. So, and also with us, we're in Los Angeles. Our particular factory is kosher certified. So we had to make sure that the sugar that we use had no animal products in it at all. So our dark chocolate is all, you know, vegan. In the kosher realm, that's called parve. That, you know, there's just no animal products at all. So that was kind of the biggest consideration, in addition to the taste. And it's not just us using it. I think Dick Taylor's using it, Dandelion's using it. There's a lot of chocolate makers out there working with Native. I think, yeah, Parliament, Monsoon, a lot of us are working with it. We had to kind of grow into it, because you can't just go to the corner store and pick up a pound of this stuff, you have to buy 2,000 pounds minimum at a time. So you have to get pallets of this stuff. So we started doing that. We actually were buying sugar from our friends up in Santa Barbara at 24 Blackbirds. Mike Orlando runs 24 Blackbirds, and we were buying, 5, 6, 7 bags of sugar from him at a time until finally we got big enough we could start bringing in our own pallets. I think we started doing that in, I want to say 2017. So for the last 3+ years, we've just been bringing it in on our own. But we've been using native sugar for pretty much the majority of our company. But we have played with a bunch of different sweeteners over the years for sure.
Cool. And so before I go to the next question, I just wanted to put out a poll for everybody who's on. It's about, what's your favorite bar of the tasting today, and if you'd be interested in further tastings similar to this one down the road. So I'm going to launch it, and we'll get into the next questions. And once everybody is able to answer, then we'll just reveal those. So another question that was like sort of a follow-up around the sugar realm is does the flavor of chocolate change depending on when you add the sugar in? And then the question is, the follow-up is, when do you normally add your sugar in?
So yes, it does matter. It definitely does affect the final flavor. It also affects the texture. So if you think about nibs, right? So you've got a cocoa bean. Let's just blow it up visually. Imagine a cocoa bean's this big. You've got a nib. It's maybe that big, right? So what ends up happening is as it goes underneath those stone wheels, you're crushing down the size of those nibs and you're releasing cocoa butter. So what ends up happening is when you introduce sugar into the system, what you need to make sure is that you're coating each of those sugar particles, in addition to the cocoa solids, you need to coat both of those with cocoa butter. Now, some beans have naturally more cocoa butter than others, like what Glenn was saying. Typically speaking, it's around 50%, but it can go anywhere from 42 all the way up to 58, 60%. So for example, we make a bar using cocoa beans from Costa Rica. Very, very high in cocoa butter content. I mean, it's like water when we're working with it. It's incredible. We don't have to add a drop of cocoa butter to that. Whereas our Ecuador, for example, I think has the least amount of cocoa butter of all of our origins. And that one, I think we had about 2%. So again, the beans themselves, and even harvest season to harvest season, that value can change. So for example, rainy seasons, rainy harvests tend to have slightly less amounts of cocoa butter than summer harvest. I'm not really exactly sure why. There's also anecdotally a difference in the latitude of where the trees are growing. So the further north or south you go from the equator, the more cocoa butter is in the bean. So, and again, that's just very anecdotally. There's no like scientific papers that I know of about that that have been released yet. But basically, you've got a huge 20% cocoa butter range. So when I say we add cocoa butter and I say it's like 1 to 2%, that's less variation than you would naturally get in the bean anyway. It's virtually nothing. If we do add it, it's because we really feel that it does help the mouthfeel. So kind of going back to the sugar, depending on when you add the sugar, if you think about it, let's say, for example, that you have nibs that are still fairly large, and you start adding in the sugar. What ends up happening, and it really depends on the origin, but the coating of the sugar and then the coating of the solids could be uneven. So I know some makers will add sugar after an hour. I believe Dandelion Chocolate adds their sugar after about an hour or so. Generally speaking, we add our sugar 24 to 48 hours after we started loading the grinder. And we do that for a few reasons. The biggest one is for volatilization. So for example, in a cocoa bean, when it's fermented, so they get fermented in these wooden boxes and they just develop a whole bunch of acetic acid. Part of that gets driven off by roasting. The other part of that gets driven off by conching. So conching is basically heat plus aeration. So we have these drums that spin around, right, with the stone wheels in them, and we have a heating element that's blowing hot air over the volume, and it's blowing kind of a lot of that acetic acid off. When you add sugar earlier, it tends to lock that acetic acid in. And so what we do is we try to drive off as much as that as we can before we add the sugar, because once you add the sugar, you're kind of stuck. Some origins, like, so for example, our Ghana is just very, very chocolatey. It's very mild. There's almost no acetic acid at all. We can add sugar after a few hours. And I think the one that we wait the longest on, I want to say Zucchiale. I think we add it maybe 48 hours or even longer, but it really depends on that specific batch. So I think I've mentioned this before in some of our other tastings, but every time we make a batch of chocolate, we tweak and we change things. So there is an overall consistency in our chocolate, but we're always trying to improve things. So for example, every roast might be slightly different, or even if the roast doesn't change that much, maybe we do change when we add the sugar. So we end up tasting the beans before we roast them, after we roast them, when we first load the grinder, after, you know, several hours, and then after a day or even 2 days, then after we add the sugar, then again, once we've ground it down to its finished particle size, then after we're done aging it for a month. And I think there was a question earlier about aging.
Yeah.
Yeah, so aging, basically for us anyway, we found that the flavor profile of the chocolate has a lot of variability. And again, it depends on the origin. So for example, Ghana, it's one of the most chocolatey chocolate bars we make. You really only have to age that one for about a week or two. Whereas our Bolivia, we age that for 2 months. So what we do is we pour the chocolate into these giant steam pans. And what ends up happening is we'll break off a chunk of that after like a week or 2 weeks or whatever. And we'll keep doing that week after week until our tasting notes internally are consistent from week to week. And then we know, okay, it's not going to change anymore. Now it's ready to be released. We go back at our notes. We say, okay, after week 5, it's consistent, you know? So that's kind of what we did. And so, yeah, every bar is aged differently, and we do that because by the time someone, you know, either comes into our shop or orders online or whatever, it's already gone through that process so that you can open it up and enjoy it immediately. Whereas with some other chocolate makers, they'll even tell you like, well, we just released this. It's probably a little bit better if you wait like a month or so. We don't have the luxury of our chocolate sitting around that long, so we try to age it before we mold it up in a chocolate bar so it's just ready to go. So hopefully that answered that question.
Yeah. So we're getting a couple more questions, which is great. One was around the environmental aspects of the large logistics. You mentioned around, you know, bringing in all those beans all together. You know, what are the you know, the challenges around that? And then there's some around some questions around like further stuff we'll get to. But I guess if you want to talk about the challenges around the environmental challenges around those larger ones.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. So again, the main way that most chocolate makers bring in beans is on cargo containers. They're 40 feet long. They hold 26 metric tons. We're way too small to bring in our own containers. In fact, I was kind of surprised to find out recently that Manoa in Hawaii, they're bringing in containers. I guess they're making a lot more chocolate than they used to. But we typically will bring in 1 to 2 metric tons of any one origin at any one time. We really don't bring in more than 2 tons at a time just because we don't have a lot of room. So we don't store cacao in our factory. We have our storage off-site that's climate controlled, and we just keep everything there stored in GrainPro. In fact, tonight, when we're done here, we have to go over to our storage area because we just got a ton of Ghana. It's about 16 bags. We have to open all the sacks, you know, pour all the beans out, line them with GrainPro, fill them back up again. So I'm going to be in a lot of pain tomorrow because I invariably end up tweaking my back because of that. But kind of talking to the environmental impact. So if you think about those giant cargo ships, right, they typically hold anywhere from 10 to 20,000 shipping containers. And they burn insane amounts of fuel. They're really bad for the environment. However, they carry so much stuff that if you look at the per unit environmental impact from a shipping container, like from a giant cargo ship, as opposed to like flying it on a plane, it's actually much lower. So I'm not saying like, oh, hey, you know, shipping container or shipping giant ships like that are good for the environment. They're definitely not, but you kind of have to pick your battles. It's just inherent in the industry that we're in that we have to transport stuff around. So fortunately, there's several carbon neutralization programs that you can donate to. You can actually add on an extra fee saying, hey, I'd like this shipment to be carbon neutral, and they can actually offset that. So we do that whenever we can, and that really helps. I'm not sure how many chocolate makers are doing that, but I always encourage everyone, like, hey, you know, talk to your shipping company, find out if there's any way that you can do like carbon neutral shipping. That's definitely the way to go. And then in addition to that, you have to kind of think in terms of like the logistics of, you know, paying a farmer directly as opposed to going through 5 or 6 different middlemen. I see all the time, you know, so many chocolate makers are saying, well, this is direct trade. And it's like, yeah, but are you actually talking with that farmer and working with them directly, or are you just buying it with along with a lot of other people? You know what I mean? It's like, that gets a little weird for me. And so when we say direct trade, we'll say that for, you know, kind of specific instances where it's like, no, I'm on the phone with Desmond, or I'm on the phone with Freddie Salazar at Esmeraldas, and it's like we're wiring the money directly to them. There is no middleman. It's literally us and them, and that to me is what direct trade means. But again, you have to kind of concern yourself with, okay, well, you know, I want to bring in these really amazing beans, but I don't want to destroy the environment in the meantime, right? So there's really the only thing that you really can do with that, other than you flying there yourself or swimming back with it, or putting it on a sailing ship, which, you know, that's cute, but I don't know how realistic that is to do that. I know Mass Brothers did that several years ago, and they made a big deal about that. But you know, there's logistics as far as like, you know, how realistic do you want to be, you know, actually doing this on a day-to-day basis versus just doing something for PR, you know. So I think that's kind of the balance, if that makes sense.
Yep. So as you guys saw before, I did finished the poll, and Jamaica won the most votes, which is great. But I think some people also had additional votes for Sao Tomé. I enjoyed Sao Tomé myself, so I would have probably voted for that, even though I like all of them. So it did get some love. And then, and it seems like you guys are all up for another tasting at some point. So that's cool. So thanks for everybody who joined in on the polling questions. We did get some other great questions on blending. Have you ever considered doing a blend? Like, for example, like Dick Taylor, they make like their own like signature blend, or like they have a couple different blends that they use. Do you ever see yourself doing any blends in the future?
So it's funny, we did actually make a blend, and I think it's sitting on a shelf somewhere. I should probably take a look at that. I thought it was good too. So the thing with blends is that, yes, it's interesting, but I don't feel that I've plumbed the depths of the origins that we have been working with yet. So again, I'm kind of approaching this, you know, the whole idea of making chocolate as kind of a working experiment. So, you know, I'm very quick to tell people we have never released a finished chocolate bar ever in 6 years. We have come close. I feel that our Tranquilidad bar, for example, is probably as close as we've come to where it's like, yeah, that's kind of getting to where I want to go as a chocolate maker. But how I like to explain it is, say we're here, right? And where I want to take us is over here. And there's this huge valley of just challenge, right? And it's fascinating. Like, I want to go over there, right? But I don't know how long that's going to take. But I feel for me that, you know, once we've really mastered a specific bean or a series of beans, then we can kind of start looking into doing blends. But for me, I would look at it as, even though we've been working, you know, making chocolate or selling chocolate in stores for 6 years, I don't necessarily feel that I'm ready to start blending, because blending is a different art form. I have a lot of respect for people who do blends. I don't want to just blend for the sake of blending. I want to do it conscientiously and purposefully, and not just because it's kind of the popular thing to do or because it's what everyone else is doing. It is something that we've done some tests with very successfully, I would say, but we've never released anything. So the short answer is yes, we've played with that. No, we haven't released anything yet. Yes, maybe we will at some point.
Cool. Cool. So I think this one question, you may have already alluded to it. Just curiosity of somebody, how long do you grind in your refiner?
So the minimum that we do, I would say would be 48 hours, but it's been a while since we've run anything that short. So what we found is that, with a chocolate refiner, the melangers, the stone melangers that we use. So a picture, a bowl with a couple of stones in it, and then there's a bar that goes across the top, and that bar, there are screws on top, and you can screw that down and put pressure on those stones. What we found is that yes, you can refine faster if you put more pressure on the stones, but you end up with textural issues. Number one, if you put too much pressure on the stones, then what ends up happening is I've seen a lot of chocolate makers, they run their machines too fast and they have too much pressure. And then they wonder, well, why is it that I've grinded my chocolate for 5 days and my particle size is still massive? And it's like, well, it's because it's going too fast and the chocolate's not getting underneath the stone, right? So what we do is we just let gravity do its thing. So I've seen tons of pictures of, people like emailing us like, hey, my refiner is like completely worn out and it's only been a year, and I'll see like these horrible grooves at the bottom of the bowl. And I mean, we've had some of our grinders for, 5, 6 years, and there's no indentation at all on the bottom. They're completely smooth, and that's because we don't put pressure on ours. So it takes a little bit longer to kind of get to that initial reduction, but we find that it's a lot more consistent. So think of it this way: the more consistent your particle size is, the more smooth the mouthfeel is going to be. You can rush the process by putting a lot more pressure, but we ran into textural issues when we did that. And it's really interesting to try our chocolate compared to other people's chocolate from the same origin, even the same percentage. And you can see the textural differences, even when people use the exact same machines as us. And you can actually see that difference for yourself. So for us, we prefer to take our time. So I think we even put on our packaging, if I remember correctly, yeah, we even said we grind for at least 48 hours. Which is true, that is at least, but honestly, it's at least probably 70 hours, if not more. The longest that we grind might be Bolivia. The last batch I pulled was 150 hours, I think.
Wow.
So significant amount of time. So we don't rush stuff here. We just don't. We don't just try to spit stuff out to hit production deadlines. We will take our time. We will always take our time. And so that's why we end up having to work a lot of late nights, because it's like we're not going to rush stuff. Things will come out when they're ready. So Corey, my wife, is our production manager. So she's the one that says, hey, you need to roast these beans next. You need to load that machine next. She's the one who's like looking over my shoulder right now saying, hey, you need to get back to winnowing. So I do have to get going in a minute. But she will never say, hey, you need to pull this batch because we need to get on to the next thing. She'll never do that, because she understands, along with my philosophy, which is, the chocolate isn't done until it's done. We don't pull things just because we have a deadline. So we tend to grind longer, I think, than a lot of other chocolate makers. And at some point in the future, because I do feel that stone grinders, those kinds of refiners, are not necessarily the best way to make chocolate. We have been exploring different ideas for the future, like whether we end up using a ball mill or a universal conch, or a frise or a 3-roll mill or whatever it is. It's like there's so many different ways to make chocolate. We are not in a financial position to do that yet, so we're kind of making do with what we have. We've never had investors. We've never had money coming in from anyone else. We've literally, whatever money we put in has been generated by sales. So we have the machines that we have because we can't afford anything else yet. So maybe someday, we'll be able to, get some like super crazy, amazing machinery. I'm not really sure, but for right now, that's kind of the trade-off, which is, we have these machines, we have to run them longer to get the texture that we want, the flavor development that we want. But we're definitely exploring different options for the future for that.
Cool. We have a few more. I know we probably should take like maybe one or two more questions. One was on, and I just lost it. Oh, geez. The pricing structure for bars. So you have a wide variety of pricing for your bars. So that question, and then around running on solar power. Do you guys run on solar power, or, and if so, do you use a lot of power? Does it use a lot of power? And so,
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
yeah, no, I'll just say, like, if you guys have any other questions, you can leave them there, and then we'll answer them after, or we'll get back to you on that, because I know that David has to get back to work, so we want to be respectful of that time. So I guess with those last two questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so as far as the pricing structure goes, that more than anything has to do with the price of the beans. So think of it like, you know, not every bottle of wine is $20. Some bottles are $10, some are $4,000. It's all grape juice, right? What's the difference? So it has to do with the price that we're paying to the farmers, in addition to the amount of work it takes us to create each specific bar. So for example, commodity cacao is around $1 a pound. It's around $2,000 a metric ton. So the average price that LetterPress pays is around $8,000 a metric ton, about 4 times the going rate. That's the average that we pay. That being said, when you start getting into stuff like, you know, our Ukiale or Jamaica or Bolivia, where we're having to like air freight stuff in, you know, we're paying upwards of, I'm trying to remember what we paid Volker. I want to say it was about almost $18,000 a ton. That's 9 times the going rate, right? So what I always tell people is, imagine a Hershey bar, right? A Hershey bar is around $1, but it's got 11% cacao. So if you think about in terms of those metrics, then if, you know, Hershey's is paying $2,000 a ton, they're charging $1 for a bar at 11%, that would mean that at 70% dark, you know, it should be $7. But because we're paying 4 times as much or 8 times as much, then our bars should be $28, $36, $48 a bar. So Hershey's is actually selling their cacao for a higher price than we are per gram of actual cacao, which is kind of insane if you think about it. When you're buying a Hershey bar, you're basically just buying a block of sugar and milk powder and, you know, cocoa butter and just an itty bitty little teeny tiny bit of cacao. Even like if you go out and you buy a Lindt bar, it's like 90%, right? Well, it's actually a 60% bar with 30% cocoa butter. So, you know, and there's a lot of other fillers and things like that a lot of companies use. So for us, you know, we decided, I know that some chocolate makers just charge the exact same price on every single bar, and they just let, you know, some bars, you know, be much more profitable than others. But for us, it's like, well, let's just price it according to our costs, so that we end up making the same amount off of every bar regardless, you know, so it doesn't matter if we sell most of one or most of another. So for those of you who don't know, Ukiale is our most popular bar. We make more Ukiale bars than anything else, and that's been consistent for over 2.5 years now. So, and that's an $18 bar. So it's been interesting for us as chocolate makers, just seeing kind of what's been selling more than others. And so, yeah, price has, we thought that maybe, you know, that price point would kind of preclude people from wanting to buy it, but that actually hasn't been the case. It's kind of interesting.
Cool. Did you want to comment on the solar power, or?
Oh, sorry, wait. So again, we started off in our apartment. We, you know, we're basically threatened with eviction. And we found a shared kitchen 4 blocks from our apartment, which is where I'm currently sitting. So this was originally a shared kitchen. I think it was a cake decorating place at one point. And then we ended up taking over the space. And so for better or worse, we moved into a space that was already completely built out. We had absolutely no say in how it was built out. We had no say in how anything was set up, and we're extremely limited by what we can do here. Being that we're in LA, our biggest cost is air conditioning. We actually, so the lifespan of an air conditioning unit is usually 7 to 10 years. Our building got our air conditioning unit installed, I want to say, in 2012 2012 or 2013. And when we moved in 2017, it already started having issues. And then earlier this year, it completely failed. So we actually, our landlord installed a new one. So we're actually, somewhat comfortable again. But we've been kind of struggling with that. So the result of that is that we have absolutely no say in how we can power our factory. So when we end up moving, because we're going to be in this space here for probably another 2 years or so. I think that's how long we have left on our lease. The next place that we get, we're going to be using solar. We're going to have battery walls. We're going to do all that fun stuff and try to be as carbon neutral as possible. It's just the logistics of, the realistic issues of, just simply moving into a place and kind of just being stuck with it. So people always walk into the factory when we were open to the public, people would come in and say, why did you design it like this? We didn't. We moved into a cake decorating place and just jerry-rigged it and like moved outlets around and changed out the panel and all this other crazy stuff just to get the power. In fact, we finally got a new line installed for a new tempering machine, so we can finally get power to that thing and hopefully start using it in the next couple of weeks. So no, we're not on solar power now. Yes, we want to be, hopefully at some point, but unfortunately we are our hands are tied in our current building. It's not up to us here, unfortunately.
Cool. All right, so I think I covered all the questions. I want to just thank everybody who's still here with us. It's been a pleasure spending some time with you guys, and hope you guys had a really great experience. And so we will potentially do another one of these. And so I know that David has to get back to winnowing and making more chocolate for us to go out and get. So if you guys want to hang out around, if you have any other questions around anything, we could talk. And so from me and from David, thank you very much. We appreciate your support, and hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Thank you, everyone who participated in this. And there were a lot of people who emailed us and said that they couldn't make it today. So like Glenn was saying, we are recording this. It'll be up on YouTube. We're going to blast that out on social media once that is available, because I'm trying to remember, I think we had quite a few people purchase this particular tasting set. So there are a lot of people who aren't able to join us today, but rest assured, you will be able to follow along in the future. But Glenn, thank you so much for doing this, for hosting this. It's been great. We've been kind of working together for a while now. It's just been a really great experience. I just want to say thank you for all your hard work and with what you're doing with Chocotastery. It's really fantastic, and really, really appreciate your support of the craft chocolate industry. And so thanks to you, and thanks to everyone who participated today, and those of you who are watching this in the future, thank you as well. Really appreciate everyone's support. It's really made a world of difference to us, and just want to say thanks so much. Awesome.
All right. So I know you have to leave, David. I know some want to just hang on and talk. So so I'm able to do that. Bye, David.
You guys, thanks.
All right. So so if you want to, yeah, sure. So I did get a question around how to print the guidance sheet. So that's totally cool. I could totally walk through, Robert, if you want to just hang out, or I can give you a call, or you can give me a call. I can walk you through it. It's just the logistics of going through my website into the members area, making sure you have your account set up, and then you'll be able to print and download and print the 2 PDFs of this. So if you want, you just shoot me an email with your, or just call the number on my website. It's my support line, and then that just comes straight to me. So I'll be free rest of today if you want to do that, and so you can get those. And I know that somebody else wanted to ask a question, so you can unmute yourself if you want, and then.
Hey, Glenn.
Hey, Tom.
Hey, you're doing the cacao tomorrow, right?
Yes. So tomorrow morning, Eastern time, 11 o'clock, we're going to be doing a tasting with Cacao USA. So they have a farm in La Esmeralda in Dominican Republic. It's one of their cacao plantations of the Riesick family. And so the Cacao USA team that opened up in Brooklyn a year ago this weekend, so they are doing a 1-year anniversary event. They're doing a live tour and a tasting. So I'll be working, we'll be going live around 11 o'clock, and we'll be getting a tour. The team there is going to do like a half-hour tour around the farm and their facilities. It's going to be really great. And then I'm going to be on with Damien, their chocolate maker at the USA location, and we're going to be doing a tasting similar to this, but with 4 of their bars. They made an anniversary bundle, so we're looking forward to doing that tomorrow.
Should be fun.
Yeah. Yep. Anybody else wanted to? I know somebody else wanted to.
Yeah. Thank you, Glenn. I really appreciated this. It's opened up a whole new world for me, so I'm very
That's great
about that. Just a couple of real basics. Just 2 brief questions. Number one, when you're looking at the color of the chocolate bar, it seemed like that was really important, and I didn't understand why the color was so important. That was the first thing. So can you explain?
Yeah, sure. And so so I think David may have alluded to it. It's based on a couple of different factors. So we have so when you look at the 4 different colors I have here, it's not reminiscent of the entire spectrum, but it's based on the variety of the cacao. And so as like, compared to DNA, like we all have different DNA from all over the world. We're very diverse. We have a diverse background. So a lot of the chocolate, based on the variety, they may be lighter or darker. So for an example is for Peru, Nacional. That type of variety is Nacional. They have white beans. So they're sometimes referred to as porcelana. So those beans, they've kind of, it's kind of like a mutation of it just being, just let alone, not being messed with for many years, many decades. And so when you have that, that's like, it becomes lighter. So normally a bean, you open it up, when it's properly fermented, it's more of a dark brown or purple. So these beans are more whiter on a very, very light brown shade. And so when you're making the chocolate, when you refine it and add your sugar and all that stuff, it's going to be a lighter, almost like a milk chocolate almost. But that's if you compare both beans that are roasted and broken open, you can see that there's a difference. And it's primarily based on variety. And over the years, there could be hybrids where cacao may have been transported from one cacao producing region to another, and so the genetics may mix. So over years and over the history of whatever region you're referring to, there could be different changes to that cacao.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And the other question, it was right back at the beginning, actually, and I kind of just couldn't get the answer. There was a specific order that you started with, and I forget, was it the less sweet chocolate first or the most sweet chocolate first?
Yeah. So so it was the least sweet first. So, and just to, I'm not sure if you were when you came into the call, but we want to start with a higher percentage, so it's less sugar. So when we have more sugar initially, it may affect our palate. So we talked about palate fatigue. So there may be like the case of palate fatigue when you have a lower percentage cacao and then move your way up to a less sweeter. So when you have more, it's more pure to the actual bean flavor and less sugar, so it's less on your palate.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, no problem.
Glenn,
Yeah.
this is David Kirsch
Hey,
here.
David, how are you?
Thank you for organizing this. I actually just wanted to ask you a question about, I actually I teach a class, I'm a professor at the University of Maryland, and in the business school, and I teach a class on social innovation, basically social enterprise, social entrepreneurship. And I'm wondering if you would be, if you would be sort of amenable to my reaching out and maybe kind of proposing a kind of virtual tasting with my students, because what's really interesting to me is the idea of this whole new industry of boutique bean to bar chocolate makers has really kind of come into existence in the last few years. Probably a little bit behind, say, where coffee was,
Yep.
And maybe a little bit ahead of, say, some of the spices. I know there's some new, like, kind of sustainable spice, boutique spice industry coming along now. So anyway, it feels like chocolate is in this really interesting place. And I'd love my students to kind of get a bit of a taste, if you will, for kind of what's really happening in the industry. And anyway, so I don't know if that would be something you'd be willing to do. I mean, what I'd do is, like, I'd work with you. We could, like, I'll buy the bars and you can just kind of pop in and say, like, hey, try this, try that, kind of just, but give them a feeling for kind of how the industry is taking shape and kind of dealing with a lot of the issues that we talked about today, supply chain, sustainability, connecting to the indigenous farmers and producers, pricing, all that sort of stuff. So I don't know if is that something you've done before? Would you be open to kind of, if I were to kind of reach out to you and kind of propose something like that for the fall?
Yeah, definitely. I've done classes on chocolate making and chocolate tasting, and a lot of these topics do come up from time to time. So yeah, we could talk offline. You could just shoot me an email with your contact info, and we could set up a separate call and just talk through it. I think it's a great thing that that as an educator, you want to educate your students on the industry and the different facets of this craft chocolate movement. Like you alluded to, it's still in the nascent stages versus like coffee and wine and other like different alcohols, for example. So it's something that so my history was I started making my own confections around I started learning about chocolate 2009. Right, I graduated college in 2007. So I never knew about chocolate until 2009, right? I then was making confections on my own in my apartment, and then got to a point where in 2015, I learned bean to bar. For literally 4 or 5 years, I had no idea that the process of chocolate making. And so I did that. I've done a bunch of different classes and stuff. And when I dove into bean to bar, I kind of got the entire picture, putting 2 and 2 together of everything, and it blew my mind. And so, when I started making chocolate in my apartment, I got to a point where, I put out 6 different bars, and then got to, my job in HR was like, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do some more stuff with chocolate, and I wound up quitting my HR job, 6-figure job, moving to to Seattle to work with Indie Chocolate and be their chocolate maker out there for about 7 months. And then I decided to come back, right? And so when I came back, I literally reflected on, my contribution to the industry. I made so many different friends, just so many people who inspired me. I made my own chocolate. I made chocolate for others. I've made my own confections. I created classes in Seattle. I taught people in Seattle like how to make chocolate, how to taste chocolate, and I was like, what else is missing? And I'm like, what aspect do I really enjoy? I enjoy tasting chocolate. So then I said to myself, how could I keep this love and passion alive? And then I thought, why not do something around chocolate tasting and teaching people how to taste chocolate? And, to somebody who doesn't enjoy chocolate on a daily basis, who doesn't eat chocolate on a daily basis, that's probably like obscene and foreign. Like, why that sounds stupid. Like, who would even want to do that, right? But what I wanted to come at was, there's ways that you can connect the chocolate to your experiences in life. And so that's where I said to myself, where do bakers bake cakes and cookies and all that? And I said, a bakery, right? I answered myself in this weird dialogue I had in my mind. And then I said, all right, well, where do people taste chocolate? And then I thought of Chocotastery, and it doesn't have to be one place. It could be anywhere. And that, as long as somebody, more than one person, is able to take craft chocolate and go through a couple different steps and learn, the meaning behind these steps. That's where you can make that connection to the entire process, the farmers at origin, the stories from them, the chocolate makers and their perspective and their personality that they're throwing in to how they make their chocolate, and pull it all together. And everybody brings in that emotional experience that they've had. And I'll just tell you, my first experience was back in 2015. I had a bar. So this is like right when I started to like reach out to the industry, around June-ish. I reached out to a chocolate maker from Hawaii. His name is Nat, and he's in Madre. He was doing boot camp, chocolate making boot camp, and I had missed the cutoff. It just happened. They just did it, but I had gotten a bunch of bars at like one of the festivals, and that year, I think it was at Fancy Food or whatever it was, and I tasted it, and it tasted like it was a La Red, Dominican Republic, and I tasted it, and it tasted like malted milk. And in my mind, I was like, that's Ovaltine. And in my mind, I then connected it to me growing up as a little kid in the Bronx. And my uncle, who used to live with us, used to make Ovaltine for me when I was a little kid on Saturday morning breakfasts. And so in that moment, and I still get the chills every single time I tell that story, in that moment, I realized, wow, chocolate tastes different. And it's not like the Hershey's and like that flavor profile that we're all wired to connect chocolate with. And I knew like this is something that I need to further explore. And the rest is history. I started making the chocolate and all that. So
Glenn,
yeah.
did you see Carla Martin had her virtual meeting on Wednesday?
No, I didn't get to join that.
That's why I want to recommend to the professor there that she works out of Harvard University, and she runs a group called the FCCI. What's that? The Fine
Cacao and Chocolate Institute.
Yeah. And she's doing every Wednesday. They're doing sustainability workshops. They did their first one last Wednesday, and she's fantastic. I've heard her speak at a number of events.
What was her name again? I'm sorry.
Carla Martin, with a C, right, Carla?
Yeah, I'm gonna just put it in Carla Martin.
She's amazing. And I'm a small chocolate maker myself at home, and I buy from Uncommon Cacao.
For me.
And if you go to their website, there's a lot of just issues. They have a transparency report.
Yeah.
And it focus on a lot of the issues related to sustainability. And, David talked about Emily Stone. He met her in Belize or Guatemala. And she, I've heard her speak a number of times, and she talks a lot about trying to remove cacao from the commodity market because so people are earning what they need to earn to produce good cacao rather than having the price fluctuate based on what the market's saying.
Yeah.
And,
Cool. Well, thank you both. I appreciate it. I may follow up. Tom, could I follow up with you too, possibly? Do you want
No problem.
could you just maybe put your contact info in the chat here, and I'll
Yeah.
take that down too.
Yeah, you can look at my. I'm more of the Dominican Republic because I was in the Peace Corps in the late '80s in the Dominican Republic, and my wife's Dominican. Her family owns cacao farms, so I'm the one that David came to the DR and spent a week with, and
Yeah, that's cool.
hopefully I can get Glenn down there one day. We can spend a week or two in the DR because my
that
wife's
would be
from
awesome.
it's a city called San Francisco de Macorís, and it's like the cacao heart of the country. So during the harvest season, it's driving around the countryside. It's just the fermentation, the drying. It's just in the air. You can just smell it everywhere. It's amazing. So.
Great,
Yeah.
great. Well, thank you both, and I will be following up, and I'm going to try and put together a unit that we can do for the students that kind of both put some that's kind of tactile and put something in their mouths, and also put some kind of context around it so that they understand how industries transform.
It'll be a popular class, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think we could always work on, the types, the like I usually do 4 bars in a tasting, just so like there's no palate fatigue. We could work through what type of bars, and I could help you with all that stuff.
That'd be great.
Yeah, because I have a growing collection. I think last time I checked I think it's like over. Geez, my current count of my collection is, I'm just looking this up, 400 and probably 440 or so bars currently. So I have a bunch that are all over. So I do have a bunch that, and whatever you want to showcase and have that impact as well, like throw it in there. Yeah, we can talk through all that. It'd be cool.
Great. Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. Have a nice evening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Bye.
Take care.
Yep.
I guess it's just the 2 of us now.
Yeah, I think there's a couple others that are hanging around, I guess.
Oh, okay. No, I just I got into chocolate March 14th. An old friend of mine called me and contacted me from Honduras, and he has a cacao plantation, and he started growing cacao and worked with the trader, commodity trader, and was breaking even, like wasn't making enough money, and decided to start making tree to bar. So he has a bar called Yajoa Chocolate in Honduras, and I've actually educated myself in the last 3 months being locked down here in Los Angeles, and I immersed myself just like you did a long time ago, or not that long ago, and here I am now doing the tasting with you. And the funny thing is that last Saturday I went to go drop off some Goodwill items on Robertson, close to LetterPress.
Yeah.
And I had done my research about that company, and of course I'm following them on Instagram. And it turned out that the Goodwill was closed, and I thought, well, wait a minute, LetterPress is right here. Let me, I haven't been able to actually go and try other chocolates.
I think I lost you. JR, I think I lost you.